Military officials from nearly 60 nations and 6 organizations are gathering in Beijing for the 9th Xiangshan Forum with the theme Maintaining International Order and Promoting Peace in the Asia-Pacific. What defines the relations among major powers in this era? How can security of medium and small nations be safeguarded in a time of great uncertainty and the rise of populism? And how is China expected to take more responsibilities on the global stage? Today, in the first half, I'll be talking to Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from the Ministry of National Defense of the People's Republic of China. And when we come back, I will be joined by Mr. Nicholas Swanstrom, the Director of the Institute for Security and Development Policy. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue, Senior Colonel. Now, the topic for this year's Xiangshan Forum is actually about the relationship between major powers in the age of power politics. It also has a lot to do with how to look at the world order. This is a big topic, but I'd like to have your thoughts on how the Chinese would love to define the world order. Does it need to be improved in favor of emerging markets, particularly when you look at the implications of China's military buildup?
Well, actually, you have asked a litany of great questions. But to start with, I would say that as one of the organizers, I certainly know why we have chosen this topic, because China is an Asia-Pacific country, but also a world power. Therefore, for the first session, we have deliberately made the relationship among major power and the international order as the first plenary session. Because since China is a major power, therefore it is very natural for China to discuss this issue. But at the same time, we have to consider that how it might affect the international stability. Talking about the international order, well, the first question is whether the international order is really the so-called liberal international order. I don't think so, because if you talk about liberal international order, basically it starts from 1940 onwards. This is what the West believes. But from then on until now, there are actually so many great events. For example, China's role for the developing country, for the third world, and India's role in a non-alliance movement, and the independence of more than 30 countries in Africa. All these are major events. They are not included in the liberal international order.
Then can we call it the illiberal world order?
Well, however you call it, I think it doesn't really matter. This is just like William Shakespeare said, if it is a rose, it doesn't matter how you call it, so long as it smells sweet.
Mm-hmm. To be or not to be, that's a constant topic for policymakers to discuss regarding the world order. What do you think is the role that China could play to shape the landscape of military buildup? I mean, China certainly pioneers somehow the prospects of emerging markets, and there are allegations that there is, at this moment, the most dynamic arms race in Northeast Asia, with China playing the leading role. If you look at the defense budget, do you agree, or do you think you have to defend the Chinese position about the so-called arms race?
Well, I don't think there is such a kind of arms race in East Asia. If you are talking about China, China's objective is clear to everybody, that we want to become a world-class military by the mid-century. And we believe it is achievable. Why? Because of the strong commitment of the Chinese government, because of a low but sustainable defense investment of less than 2% annually, and because of China's defense industry that can virtually produce almost everything we want. So we can achieve this goal. But having said that, what then will this world-class military do? That is the question. Well, to answer this question, if we look at the last 40 years, we can clearly see that China's overall strength, including military strength, has been rising. But China hasn't shoot at anybody. So the last 40 years for the Chinese military is a miracle in human history. That means we have become so strong, but we have not used our increased strength against anybody. So such kind of fallacy or theory of China threat is nonsense.
You like it or not, we are lucky that in the White House there is this president, Donald Trump, who doesn't favor the idea of using force. Look at how he has ousted his former national security advisor, John Bolton, who always wants to use force in solving problems such as the crisis with the Persian state of Iran. Does it mean we either have this presidency, Donald Trump, who is not in the mood of using force, or we have had established enough crisis management mechanisms in East Asia regarding particularly the so-called freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea?
Well, I believe as an American president, he has a huge administrative power. So how should he use his administrative power in making conflict avoided between China and the U.S.? He should ask Pentagon to reduce or even stop the freedom of navigation operations of the Chinese islands and the rocks, because these kind of things are really not helpful in preventing this kind of conflicts, because we China and the United States have certain rules about how to avoid this kind of a conflict during close distance. But the point is, there is a strategic aspect in this kind of encounter. That means Americans plan to come to challenge you. It's not unplanned. They plan to challenge you. Then that invites a question of how China would look at this kind of issues. Because China is getting stronger, because China consider it's a sovereignty issue, while the United States would consider it a legal issue. So there is a great discrepancy in our understanding. But if we have different understanding, what should we do? We should talk about it. We should not challenge each other or provoke each other. That would invite danger, conflict, or even war.
We believe many dialogues must have been conducted to build and strengthen the crisis management or damage limitations. Having said this, the INF treaty has been cancelled between the Russian Federation and the United States, because President Trump said it was the product of the Cold War and they should live up to the new situation in the post-Cold War era. Now, why China is somehow involved in the game of nuclear disarmament? China says we won't join this treaty as yet another party. What do you make of the position of the Chinese government?
Well, China is certainly very active in nuclear disarmament, because China actually is the first country who has proposed non-targeting of nuclear weapons at each other after Indo and Pakistan's nuclear test in 1998. And China again has proposed no first use of nuclear weapons against each other, which is accepted only between China and Russia, understandably because of the good relationship between China and Russia. In terms of INF Treaty, according to CIPRI, a think tank in Stockholm, both United States and Russia have more than 6,000 nuclear warheads. France has 300, China has 290. So therefore, how could China be involved to have such kind of negotiation to reduce the nuclear warheads? This kind of request is just like a fat man inviting a lean man, say, let's go on diet together. You are 200 kilos, I'm 100 kilos. How could we go on diet together?
Perhaps it's not the number of nuclear warheads, but rather the capability to deliver the nuclear warheads to the territory of the proposed enemy that will matter by the end of the day. But before we conclude the first part of our dialogue, Senior Colonel, what do you think of the issue of representation of the Xiangshan Forum compared with the Shangri-La Security Dialogue and the Munich Security Conference, both of which have enjoyed enough spotlight of the media? How could we look at the importance or representation of the Xiangshan Forum?
Well, if we look at the security forums in the world, there are a few most influential ones. The first one is the Munich Security Conference, which was attended by more than 20 heads of states the year before last when I went and see. So, but that Munich Security Conference was basically Eurocentric. It looked at the world, understandably, from a European point of view, and for them, the international world is falling apart. Europeans are worried. Russia is a threat. China is rising in the Far East. Basically, that's it. For Shangri-La dialogue, it's more focused on China and the U.S. relationship. And that is reflected in the arrangement of the organizer IISS. You have attended, and I have attended. Normally, the U.S. Secretary of Defense would be the first to speak on the first day, and then the Chinese head of delegation would be the first to speak on the second day, because that would give enough time for the Chinese to counterattack what the U.S. has said ill of China. In terms of Xiangshan Forum, it's different. First of all, the invitation goes to different continents of the world. Unlike Shangri-La dialogue, which only invites certain countries, China would invite African countries, Latin American countries, and so all the countries in the world are represented. Besides, it's more balanced, I would say, because in this year's forum, we talk about a major power relationship, but we also talk about the interest of medium power and small states to make a balance. So in China, we give floor to everybody.
Thank you so much. The representation itself, the Xiangshan Forum, actually reflects the perhaps alleged ambition and the global vision of the Chinese authorities in building what China calls a world or community of a shared future. With that, we come to the end of the first part of our program on the annual event of Xiangshan Forum on regional security with Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from the Ministry of National Defense of the PLA. When we come back, I'll be joined by Mr. Nicholas Swanstrom. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome to Dialogue, Nicholas. Everybody's talking about the world order. The ongoing Xiangshan Forum also addresses the international order. The question is, how shall we define the world order, which was first constructed in the wake of the Second World War under the U.S. leadership? Do you think this is outdated, or it needs to be improved based on the dramatic change in power equation?
I think it definitely needs to be discussed and potentially being upgraded or changed and redefined, because what we see is the power has shifted away from United States and Europe into Asia-Pacific. And what we see here is now new actors coming in. China, of course, is a major actor and a security provider, but also India, Indonesia, and Japan. So, of course, we need to discuss this, and we need to figure out exactly what are the new characteristics of this world order, and how should we sort of work with this order and establish a safer world, basically.
Will you say the quiet shift of power from America and Europe to the Asia-Pacific region? The United States is an important part of the Asia-Pacific region. So does this fact fundamentally indicate any real and substantial change in the power equation?
I think it does. Of course, the United States will maintain its sort of role over time. I mean, the United States will continue being the most powerful armed forces in the world, but there still has been a major shift here, where we see the Asian nations taking a greater role.
In terms of arms race?
Well, in terms of not only in arms race, in a certain extent, but also in providing security. I think what we need to see is China taking a greater international role, but also Japan maybe taking a more active role, as well as India. So we are looking at a shift in this, and that is, I think, fundamental. It doesn't mean Europe will sort of leave the world stage, or that the United States will be inconsequential, but it means that more actors, we have a much more broader security cooperation and security challenges internationally.
There's no question about President Putin's intention to move their strategic focus from Europe to the Asia-Pacific region, when you look at the importance or growing importance of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization across the Euro-Asian continent. However, when you take a second look at the power structure in the Asia-Pacific region, it's basically composed of traditional treaty alliances, such as those between the United States and Japan, and you can see 5 of them in this region, basically, that we inherited from the Cold War, which came to an end in the early 1990s. So in this case, do you think the regional order, which is an important part of the world order since 1945, needs to be improved or defined?
Well, I think the old sort of power coalitions that we inherited from the Cold War will be maintained to a certain extent. And I think Russia is very much into that traditional thinking. But I think we also need to start thinking in new terms. Where can actually China cooperate with the United States? We have a trade conflict. We have conflicts between the United States and Europe as well on trade. But we still need to create a much broader security network because we are facing new challenges.
But we don't have a security mechanism, do we?
No, we don't. And I think that's the big flaw in the Asia-Pacific.
And what makes the situation even worse is that Russia and China have made it very clear they don't want to forge a treaty alliance. Instead, they would prefer to have a strategic partnership. That's very different from the military alliance that the United States shares with the 5 other countries in this region.
Absolutely. I mean, there are differences. On the other hand, these are old relationships that still continues to have a value. The question for me is really, how do we incorporate China, how do we incorporate India, Indonesia, etc., into a broader security framework? I don't think we could dismantle the old structures immediately. But I think we can make them more inclusive and more trans-regional in a sense. And I hope that Europe as well will take a bigger role in this. I'm not very confident, but I would at least hope so.
Enormous efforts have been made jointly by Singapore and other heavyweight participants of the Shangri-La Security Dialogue each year since perhaps 15 years ago. China was involved and engaged on this important platform. However, when I heard the spokesperson of the Central Military Commission of the PLA at the press conference in Singapore each year without exception, so they would always repeat the same message. When China was absent from this platform, we were still the target of scathing criticism. When we did appear, we are the sandbag for them to bash. So in this case, China would naturally have a strong mixed feeling about its presence in Shangri-La dialogue. But we are talking smart about engagement. You have, on the one hand, the commitment and ambition to engage China. On the other hand, when China shows up, we are bashed in the crusade. How could you elaborate the importance of engagement in this way?
Well, I think that it is true that China is criticized. I mean, and if you start looking at it from an American perspective, for example, they have a reason for it, as well as, of course, China has a reason to criticize the United States. But I think the big difference we see now is that up to now, the shift to Asia-Pacific has been more of an academic debate. But now we're really seeing a shift in economic growth in not necessarily per capita, but definitely general growth of nations towards Asia-Pacific. I do not see that we will stop that sort of the Cold War tendency. There will be China's rising power, will have its share of conflicts with the United States. This is nothing we're going to see disappearing.
This needs to be recognized. However, the United States refuses to recognize it. Ends up instead opting for geopolitical competition, taking China as public enemy #1 in many of its official documents since the Trump administration took office.
Sure, and I think that's...
I think that mean the return of a Cold War?
I think we will see elements of a Cold War in the sense of economic tension. We will also see clashes in certain maritime areas. We will see conflicts, for example, in Africa. But I do not necessarily project it to be a Cold War as we had between the Soviet Union and the United States. But there will be elements of conflict. I don't think it's an illusion to think that this will be a frictionless international order. On the other hand, you do have regions such as Europe that are divided, that would be seeking a greater engagement beyond the transatlantic sort of alliance, especially as we see under Trump, because there's quite a lot of criticisms also in Europe about the behavior of Trump, not least what happens in Syria.
Despite the negative impact of a Brexit, Madame von der Leyen, former Defense Minister of Germany, has been elected President of European Commission, and she vows to turn continental Europe into a formidable self-defense force geopolitically. Does it mean that the European Union stands ready and united to step into the Asia-Pacific region as a major ally of the United States to patrol, for example, the South China Sea and even Taiwan Straits?
I wish the European Union would be able to project that sort of force and that sort of coherent policy. I think it's a good vision, and I think that Europe definitely needs to strengthen its military capacity, but primarily for our own neighborhood, and of course
because of Russia? Because
of Russia very much, but also because of the challenges we see in Middle East, in sort of the Balkans, etc. But I think it's a bit premature to see European Union act as a security actor. Individual states will definitely, France, and of course UK, which is leaving, maybe even Germany. But Europe as a single coherent unit, it's too early to project that. So I would love to see it, a greater international role for Europe, but I think we have to wait for that.
Now, Nicholas, in your observation, by the end of the day, what is the major and the most menacing threat from a geopolitical perspective do you think politicians will have 10 years from now? Let us know more about the real, genuine European concerns about their own security.
Well, I mean, of course, if you look at external threats, Russia is the most immediate threat, and we see that China is over projected as the long-term threat. But from my own side, and I'm very sort of pro-European, and I believe strongly in the European Union, but I think the biggest threat is really internal. We need to build internal cohesion. We need to project European identity and force. And we have largely failed. We are very divided today, and we need to find a way to consolidate that sort of European identity and to build the long-term strategic force that you sort of talked about and said that will Europe be able to project force in Asia-Pacific? Not until we have solved our own internal differences. And here it's really important that the European Union starts debating. What is Europe? How do we move? This is not saying you're on one side or other side. We really need to get our act together, and the politicians need to take those uncomfortable decisions to build a stronger European Union.
And do you think Brexit and the rise of far-right movement are likely to divide the European continent, the united front of the European Union?
I think Brexit actually could be rather useful in the sense that England or UK was the most critical of deeper integration, so that obstacle might disappear. But the whole populist movement and what you see, the polarization in Europe between the right and the left, of course will create tension. And I think the populist movement are really one of the challenges we need to look at. I'm not overly concerned because I think as soon as they receive power, they have power for a short period, and then we tend to see that transformation. So Slovakia being one case in point, but also Poland has sort of encountered that sort of positive change. But I think it's more fundamental. We need to create that European identity. And Europe is good for Europe. European Union is good for Europe. But that needs to be projected. European Union has actually been quite poor in explaining what Europe does, what European does for Europe.
And in no likelihood, China would repeat much the same question as to what is the biggest threat for our national security. Does it also come from within? That's an issue that I keep open for our next round of discussion on the same program, Dialogue. Until next time, goodbye.